Hey folks, Steve here with a special Axis Empires Ultimate Edition video for you today. This video is my post-mortem for my Dice of Decision campaign. So this is, if you're not familiar with my video series style, this is sort of a look back at the campaign and just talking about strategy, critical events, the way that the mechanics work together to get to the consequences and results that we got. This is not a real review. A review will be coming next. But just to kind of look back and talk about the campaign. Would you believe it that this is the 40th video that I've done on Axis Empires Ultimate Edition, which is a lot. Now, granted, I've certainly had games that I've covered with more videos, I think, anyway. But I don't think anyone can say I didn't put my time into this product. So certainly a milestone, and the review will make for 41, I guess, when I get there. A couple of things. I want to get out of the way because I think it's important to point out. Our campaign ended early, but I had a suspicion that it might go that way because as we exited the DOD, the Dice of Decision, excuse me, process, I could tell things were a little balanced in favor of the Axis. There was no real doubt of it likely helping them. I couldn't be sure, but I suspected it would. Though I would say through 1937 and 1939, we certainly could have run into situations where their luck didn't go as well, and maybe some of this would have flipped back on them. But they managed to hold on to good results throughout, and it led to, excuse me, an automatic victory, which is kind of okay. Folks might look at this and go, "Oh man, we're going to miss out on 1942, 43, 44." Well, I don't know, what that would have really looked like because I think the German faction and its allies were going to be overrunning Russia before too long, or at least put them in a really bad state. I had not brought this up, but the Germans were sitting on a mass surrender card from Fortunes of War pool during Total War. So if they could get, a nice big bundle of Russian units out of supply, they were going to poof those guys and probably have some free access to the rails to get them out to Archangel, to Kuybyshev, who knows beyond that. The Americans and the British would be trying to make a landing probably in Portugal or Lisbon, but who knows? I mean, it just looked like to me, no matter how we were going to do it, we'd drop Fortress Europa down, and the Allies are going to have a hard time making up the deficit across those couple of years. And there's some reasons why, and we'll talk to that, and I think these are sort of the big impacts of Dice of Decision, but um, I'm okay with that. This was, I knew from the get go, it really an experiment. I went through the Dice of Decision process, but I put my weight, my thumb on the scales, right? I chose results. I didn't just roll them. My intention was to get a DoD game, a Dice of Decision game that was going to be very interesting in terms of like what's the story here, what's the alternate history. That would be fun to experiment playing the game with, and this was that. That was successful. I think it would be really hard to get exactly the same setup from Dice of Decision for 1937 by naturally rolling and just taking the results that you get. The Dice of Decision book does point out that if you go through the process and you wind up with something that doesn't look balanced, either bid for sides and have that affect your strategic hex rating, or just start over. And I think that's a valid thing. I mean, you could end up with something really goofy. But I think if you're naturally going through the die rolls, you could wind up with something also different, but not as badly, balanced, I guess is one way to put it. So if you're watching my campaign, or if you're watching this video and you were going, oh man, I don't know about this Dice Decision stuff, it might make things too kooky. Let me throw that concern out the door and just say, I think you would get a more fair result if you went through naturally. You would get more, um, probably, less shattered results. So like a lot of craziness happened here. You probably wouldn't get such extremes. You could still get weird stuff like maybe a democratic Russia. If Germany stayed imperial Germany, that form of like hard monarchy is considered a totalitarian ideology. So just, the only reason Germany is democratic is because we softened into a constitutional monarchy, even more than you could consider Germany during the imperial era, with an assembly, a parliament, and all that good fun stuff. So we were like a democracy with a monarch, and yes, many European nations are that way today. Um, so even those slight changes, would drastically affect the game situation, and we'll talk about that in another minute. Um, of course, this campaign was wildly crazy, like communist America, communist Britain. That's really off the wall stuff. But I wanted to lean into that. I wanted it to be super weird, so that it was more fun for me to play, and it was. I succeeded, but this is not probably going to be most folks' experience with Dice of Decision. I will say, Dice of Decision is, if you're worried about what does this add to the package of Axis Empires, I don't think I have any issue in saying it is a great add. I think Dice of Decision is a lot of fun. This was very cool. It's a very cool process to go through. I really enjoyed even just going through it from beginning to starting up 1937. Um, it is a toy in the best sense, right? Like, that is not a derogatory way of referring to it. It is a toy in the best way. You can just mess with it. You can play around with it. You can set stuff up and see what that would look like. Even if you're not even planning to play through an actual campaign, you can just kind of like go through it. Use your Dice of Decision stuff in Vassal and just see what the game looks like. You could spend a couple hours just doing that kind of thing, and it would be fun to do that. I'm so glad that this Ultimate Edition includes it. I'm glad that they revised it. They enhanced it to include Dicenso. It's a very, very cool thing. So I mean, that alone is what a great add to a World War II game is something like this, and being able to trace a really clear narrative through that altered setup. And you figure how many different die rolls, how many different table results, someone can calculate what are the possible number of game start results. Maybe someone's already done that. I don't know. It's a lot. So you have so many different ways to play Axis Empires with the Dice of Decision. I mean, it was such a cool thing to do. I was very stoked to do this, and that's why I pushed on it the way that I did to get weird results, because I just wanted to experiment with it. I'd call this experiment a success because I got to do the things I wanted to do with it and see how it all came together. So. Um, Let's talk about the way it actually panned out, though, for a hot second, and we'll look to Western Europe for a moment to understand just why it was so imbalanced. So, ideology has a huge amount of things to do with it, and I think you could easily say that was the greatest factor affecting it. Um, and I'm trying to reference the book here for this. Uh, well, I'm gonna have to look up some stuff later, but the way they reference it is, the countries on the map are either uh, communists, socialist ideology, totalitarian, or democracy. And there's wiggle room in those definitions, but you're going to fall in one of three buckets. And they are tiered. Democracy is better than socialism. Socialism is better than uh, totalitarianism. And don't split hairs over definitions there, guys. But just the alignment there enables, in the base game, right, in the non-dice of decision game, it means that the Western allies, because they're historically the democratic faction, can liberate countries from totalitarian control. It's a great advantage. It's a great thing. The Soviets, as a socialist ideology, though in the base game they don't necessarily, there's not that labeling involved, they can liberate countries from totalitarian control, Axis control, via those political events, the conditional events that say, hey, you can liberate an Axis controlled country. Well, in Dice of Decision, that's handled differently. And in fact, in the rule changes, um, and you have things like subjugated dependent activation, minor country occupation, um, and so you can see there's an equivalent in the base game called Axis country occupation, but they changed it here in Dice of Decision to refer to totalitarian ideology. So they're sort of taking these aspects of the base game and making them applicable, regardless of the faction, if they're tied to the ideology that that rule was based around. So the idea of the Axis, um, can't have multi-step units in its minor countries. Minor countries cannot move through each other's minor countries. You can't have Romanian units stomping through Bulgaria or vice versa or whatever, to some degree, or there's sort of limitations put on all those things. Well, those are constraints that are put on, generally speaking, the Axis in the base game, the totalitarian ideology in Dice of Decision. So when you have an ideology change, that actually has dramatic effects, right? And in the case of our game, Japan had a totalitarian ideology. Germany, or we'll say European Axis, but you know what I mean, um, had a democratic one, and then everybody else had socialist. And so what that meant was, for Germany, every time they conquered, quote unquote conquered, whenever they took the capital and all the cities of a minor country, instead of having to say it's conquered and now we need to leave a step behind in the capital to kind of keep the country suppressed, they were liberated. What that meant was now that country's force pool goes into Germany's force pool, and we don't have to garrison the country if we don't want to, unless we want to just have something there to defend it in case somebody attacks it. Which meant we don't have to garrison stuff behind us, which is super, super important. In addition to that, it also means that Germany and its minor convoys can be kind of cross compatible. That's something that the democracies tend to have. They also were able to have minor countries move through each other's territory. So all those benefits that you would see happen in, say, a regular Axis Empires campaign, where like you liberate France and as the Americans or what have you, and maybe you start getting French steps and they are moving through territory in Belgium, Holland, and the whole thing. Well, that ability just belonged to Germany, and what's super powerful is the fact that the Axis controls the momentum of the game, and they tend to be the ones seizing territory. So while the democracies tend to have to wait until the late stages of the war before they really start liberating countries on the map, and the Soviets when they get into Poland or Romania or what have you, Germany was able to do that from the beginning. I mean, from limited war on, any place they waltzed into, they were going to keep, and they were going to keep pretty consistently. um, and they didn't have reduced strength garrisoning, right? You imagine for a second here, right? You have to leave guys in Paris, you got to leave guys in Brussels, you got to leave guys, in each and every little minor country that you're conquering, because you have to, right? If you don't, then that country reactivates it liberates itself, and you have to deal with that. Well, that was never a concern for Germany, right? We just roll through, we leave it empty. If we don't think it's in the direct line of attack of the enemy, we can keep rolling. And when you look at, the gains from that, in terms of steps, there's not very much, because you still can't build up units very fast. You're essentially relying on the minor production marker to give you a step per season. And I tended to only do that to put some immediate garrisons in areas that could be under threat by the Allies, but just not having to worry about it, I mean, was great. Even in Belarusia, right? We had to invade Belarusia, but we conquered it, and then we didn't have to worry about garrisoning it, and just that would have required steps left behind. We didn't have to do that. That to me, that is very critical. And really the reverse would have been true then, for the Allies, whether we're talking the Soviets or even the Western Allies. So if America and Britain land back on the continent, they get back into Portugal. Now, Portugal started as their ally. We invaded Portugal as Germany. But if the, and maybe I could have gotten, we ended up not having to do this, but I'm pretty sure this is the way it would have ended up working. The uh, the Western Allies could take Lisbon, right? They could conquer Portugal, but they can no longer liberate Portugal. They would have to leave somebody behind, okay? If they pushed into Spain and they took Spain and conquered it, not liberated it, they'd have to leave somebody behind in Madrid. They get into France and they took France, they took Paris, they'd have to leave somebody behind in Paris. They'd have to leave somebody behind in Brussels. They'd have to leave somebody behind in Metz. They'd have to leave somebody. They'd have to leave somebody behind in Rome. And that might not seem like it's too bad, but you got to remember, it takes away from the force pool. So yes, they could maybe use detachments, but that still leaves them open to things that can chip away detachments. So maybe they leave a step behind. Well, each step used for that purpose is one less on the front lines. And if Germany's well defended, around its main country areas, um, even just a few steps fewer than you normally would be a tremendous difference. And that not only wears down the Western Allies, but it makes them, weaker on the point of contact. That would be a huge disadvantage for them, basically. And you figure, where we managed to get to on the map here. I mean, we're fighting over here. France really not in that much danger, but even then we were starting to garrison the coasts. Um, just a really powerful mechanic there to I think if you're the Axis powers in the Dice of Decision campaign, you want to be democratic. And when we apply this to Daisenso for a second, for Daisenso, look like Japan has almost nothing left in its force pool to really be garrisoning things. They're kind of already at their limit. They're out of detachments. They're out of very many units to have much more. They'd have to be relying on cards for more reinforcements to their force pool to keep up. But they're at every stage, Japan's about out of stuff to put on the board. They can't even think about invading the Philippines because they don't really have the steps to do it. They even put detachment markers down, assuming they capture it, which is just as well because the Philippines are independent. Um, Now imagine for a second if Japan was democratic. It wasn't. That could have been a die result, but I didn't. I let that one be a random die roll, and they didn't become democratic. But if for some reason we did, right, I would have to double check the rules here. But if that were the case, we could have liberated Hopei. We could have liberated Szechuan and Yunnan and get those guys on our side. We couldn't do that to Kansu or Kiangsu because that same rule applies that they can never be conquered. I don't. Maybe that means they can be liberated, but I don't think that's the case because they're considered like there's sort of this in between as major factions. But I think you could still liberate every other Chinese minor, which again, think about that for a second. If we didn't have to garrison these countries any longer, and all we had to focus on was keeping Kansu and Kiangsu down, we'd be getting back one, two, three, four, at least four steps. And for Japan, 4 steps is huge. So I mean, I think you want the active power, which tends to be the Axis, right? The ones that are really busy making stuff happen in the early phases of the game. If they're democracies, the game's just so much easier. I mean, it's absurdly easier because they've got the momentum. It's good to be the good guys, I guess, right? I mean that's important. What's equally important is that the opponents of the Axis not be democracies, because if they are also democracies, or whomever happens to be a democracy, you don't get to liberate. right? You have to conquer. So a democracy invading, taking over a democracy, you conquer them. You don't liberate them. And so if we had gotten any other result than what we got, this kind of stuff wouldn't have happened in Europe, right? If we had Britain, we could afford to have maybe one of these guys being, if Britain was a democracy, or I say the Western Allies on the Krieg map, which is really represented by Britain for the most part, um, if they were democracies, right, and Germany was a democracy, well, it's just democracies having a fight, and Germany would not have gotten all these advantages. So those ideology plays are probably the biggest contributor, but there are other contributors. Um, Obviously, the geopolitical state on the map also had a big impact, and in fact, it's funny the way it works. Like everything kind of worked in Germany's favor, geographically speaking, there as well. Okay, so if you look at the map and understand just the Axis victory proposition requires retaining gray hexes, gaining green and red ones. Ordinarily, Lisbon's almost never even a point of concern in a regular game, right? And if you follow the historical narrative, um, Germany gets Brussels, gets Paris, gets Oslo. It's sort of the start that really gets them uh, moving well into Axis tide. They don't do sea lions, so they never get London. Uh, Lisbon and Portugal is just too hard to get to, and Spain stays neutral after its civil war. And because we didn't have a civil war, we were able, that just never happened in the game. We were able to have diplomacy cards instead as the Axis, and getting the this is going to be about proximity, right? You you would like to be able to either diplomatically influence a country with an allied strategic hex that is far away, um, and that you're not going to be easily grabbing with military. Now, Lisbon was the special exception in our campaign because we managed to get Spain. Spain, with the free passage, allowed us to get over here and actually fight for Lisbon. Though Lisbon was a very hard fight. I mean, it was frustrating. It took much longer than I think we wanted it to take, but so it was going. Um, and we had to deal with that. Sorry, we're in glare land over here, but that's one example, right? It's far away. You almost never get that hex in a normal Axis Empires campaign, I would think, unless you get really lucky and you get Spain on your side, right? That's how you do it, and that's how we did it. But we did it, we were fortunate in that there wasn't a civil war to deal with. We sort of, could venture uh, diplomatic influence early, and look at um, you know by another example, Greece, right? Ordinarily, Athens, you have to take with some concerted effort after you've fought your way through Yugoslavia. Well, Yugoslavia didn't exist in our campaign. Austria-Hungary did, and um, I had at one point thought maybe we're going to have to invade Greece, but we got lucky on some diplomacy rolls, or not even diplomacy role. It was a diplomatic incident, and Greece and Bulgaria started fighting, and that just gave us Greece, right? So another, in this case, a strategic hex that usually takes some doing to get to, right? You got to deal with mountains. You kind of have to get all the way down here. That's all the way. Even if you have Italy on your side, you got to go all the way down. We didn't have to do that. We just got it. We just got it. Easy, easy peasy. Same thing with Persia. Persia was another one. Ordinarily, really hard for the Axis to get to Persia. But we were able to use diplomacy and get it because it was adjacent to territory owned by Turkey, and Turkey was in our alliance at that point. So we had sort of this domino effect, if you will. Not to steal the term of history here, but because we had successfully gotten the Ottomans in, and that was a really lucky set of die rolls. The fact that we got what we needed out of our cards early on. We didn't get a fully mobilized Ottoman Empire, which would have been much better, but we at least got something. We got the free passage, and then we eventually converted them over with more influence. Um, at least I think that's how it happened. I'm not remembering all the way. But just getting the Ottoman Empire was huge. It gave us two strategic hexes right out of the bat, right? And then it gave us at least the good potential to pick up a third, and that's pretty absurd. Obviously, picking up Ukraine was another big important one because that was two. So you figure one, two, three, four, five, six, um, six strategic hexes, right? Without them, we'd be at +9, so still pretty good as the Axis. We'd be at Axis tied 3 without them. But all those strategic hexes came in through diplomacy, and the shape of the map contributed to that. If for some reason the Ottoman Empire didn't have Iraq, then maybe we'd only be getting Egypt. If the Ottoman Empire or the Turks didn't have Egypt, vice versa, whatever, then Egypt is this far away strategic hex that's really hard to get to. That's going to require a lot of extra effort to get, and we didn't have to do that. It just was handed to us. Yay, congrats. We could focus. We had to, in terms of military effort, we took Belgium, Holland, easy. We took France, easy, especially because France was both unprepared and a neutral minor country. So that's another thing we're going to talk about here in a second. Oslo, easy. London was harder, so we got fortunate there. And then the tough fight for Russia helped us to kind of seal the deal and win the game. But when you really think about it, it's not as though, the Russian ones were hard fought, we'll say, but most of the other strategic hexes that we picked up via warfare were not that hard to pick up. London, Moscow, Rostov, those were tricky. But that's only, what, three? Byelorusia was easy, right? We stomped over a minor country. So, in terms of the diplomatic shaping of the map, right, most things are pretty much in Germany's favor from the get go, right? We had a package deal with the Ottoman Empire if we could get it. That gave us two, and then the possibility of getting another one later. All of that panned out successfully. Greece was kind of a random get, which was good. Um, and then, if I don't have to worry about these other theaters, if I'm not spending time worrying about Yugoslavia because it doesn't exist, and it's my ally or its constituent parts belong to Austria-Hungary, which is my ally, that's a big difference, right? I could focus on deploying a lot of steps to Britain, and in fact, garrisoning the whole country while it was still weak before it could get a lot of steps onto the map. And I think the card play order probably helped to weaken Great Britain. I'm not sure if maybe I could have played cards in a slightly different order that would have allowed more steps to show up in Britain by the time it mattered, but we really had a hard time defending that island early on. I mean, Britain just could not hold. Uh, Based on the German things I was throwing at it and the DRMs by that point, that's sort of the other big factor. The DRMs made Germany really strong. So all that limited war gains, all the diplomatic strategic hex gains, gave us such a great Axis tide die roll modifier that we could go toe to toe with the British Navy and expect to get our support markers back. And you tend not to lose an entire fleet in an engagement, so Germany could count on having a pretty good chance of making the English Channel crossing. Made even more so by the fact that during the Dice of Decision process, I got 4 shipbuilding points that Germany could spend. This is one of the results for Germany. I have to go look it up in the book. It's in there. You get the 4. Yeah, Constitutional Kaiser. You get 4 SVPs to spend immediately for selecting the Kriegsmarine Surface Fleet. And then the ships that you purchase with those go into the conditional events box. And once we were at war, and we already had pretty good die rolls, we were quickly getting our carriers, German carriers. They're crappy carriers. They're not very good, but you get 2 of them. I built 2 of them anyway. I prioritized that. So I think it's the only ones that Germany can even get, and I built them. And what this meant was when we were going toe-to-toe with Britain, while Britain had carriers of its own, it kept the naval battles to day combats, which meant, it's really the air that's getting the focus. So it's not as though the Imperial Navy was like getting shattered a whole lot because the British wanted to sink those German carriers, and the German carriers were seeking to sink the British carriers. So it was really carrier fighting with a bunch of battleship escorts. And we did see some battleships sunk. We did see some battleships, affected or disabled, because not every single airstrike factor was against every carrier, not all the time. But and eventually we didn't have carriers in every deployment of the fleets. But that was a huge difference, right? Just giving the German Navy air cover in the form of aircraft carriers is a big deal, a huge deal, in fact. And so that was a big advantage. So I would say, if you're playing Dice of Decision and you get Constitutional Kaiser as Germany, definitely spend those build points on carriers. I think they do pay off, and that is actually a difference maker in terms of Schiffskrieg making a difference in the game. I do think those aircraft carriers made a significant contribution. Um, the other big thing here, obviously, is having Austria-Hungary as a country, as a decent sized one, and being able to get it on the Central Power side or Germany side was also a pretty big factor. And if you look at the East Front, ordinarily, right, you think about, okay, well, what would we have instead if this was a normal game? Well, we wouldn't have the Polish units that are strewn about. We wouldn't have the Ukrainian units, which a lot of them are dead, but so it goes. You'd still have some Romanian units. You'd have some Bulgarians, but they're kind of weak, for the most part. Um, the big difference is Austria-Hungary, at least at the expanded version that we have in this campaign, has access to 2 HQs. They're not strong, but they still provide a shift. So the Axis having even that many additional shifts in combat on the East Front there is pretty big. So we had German HQs, we have Austro-Hungarian HQs, and while you still have to have Austrian units involved to use those HQs, they provide a tremendous benefit and allow you to do things that, it basically increases the number of hexes you can be targeting for offensives on any given turn, especially if you have blitz markers involved, where you just get that extra oomph of a blitz enabled shift, where you could be blowing holes in the Russian lines with German units and the Austro-Hungarian units, and doing even more catastrophic damage to the ZOC positioning against the Soviets. And that was a huge gain. I mean, when you look at it and you say, well, what if I didn't have all these units over here, right? We don't have the Austro-Hungarian units. We have slightly different minor countries here in a normal game. We probably can't afford to have all these Italians up here because they're down in North Africa. How much fewer units are on the East Front for the Axis? I think it's much fewer, right? It's much fewer, and we're having to garrison our gains in the West. And so the fact that we're just kind of overrunning the Soviets in a base game situation, you wouldn't have that. We couldn't sustain that. Here we can do it because we don't need to garrison things. Granted, I'm garrisoning Britain, and that takes, 10 steps. That's a lot. But I could make up for their absence by having these Austro-Hungarians present, and all these other extra minor units. And by having Persia and the Ottomans in, we basically have the Caucasus front. We got the Caucasus in as well diplomatically. Forgot about that. Baku. That's another one. That's another one that we got diplomatically. I miscounted before. I forgot about Baku. So now the Soviets have to defend down here, and we have another strategic hex. So it's, I think to me, this is very simple math logic here for Tatala Creek. The Axis got the majority of its strategic hex gains through diplomacy. That snowballed into more diplomacy because, the more their Axis tide marker was going up, the easier it was to get good results on diplomacy. So it kind of snowballed diplomatically. And then that Diral modifier and all these extra steps continued to snowball into being able to wage the actual fighting very, very well and outpace the Allies in terms of diral modifiers because the U.S. commitment level was still at we hadn't even really begun to increase that. So the Axis, at their high tide, superpowered effectively more than a normal campaign. And of course, we're going to get an automatic victory at that point, right? I mean, it makes total sense. I'm not surprised by this. I think it's all a very strong play, to be doing diplomacy. I can say I was a bit frustrated as the Western allies and the Soviets, because it seemed like they just never got good diplomacy results. Like they'd get some influence out, but they could seemingly never quite get it again. If you imagine even for a second that Germany didn't get the die roll necessary to get Austria-Hungary in, and the Allies flipped Austria-Hungary to their side, this would be a very different game. Very different game, in fact. I mean, it would be catastrophically different. Maybe too easy for the Western Allies because Austria-Hungary is just that useful. I mean, maybe they'd end up getting conquered, but in the meantime, right? It's a huge distraction, to have Austria-Hungary against Germany in that. And Germany only really got it because of some decent die rolls. They maybe could have pulled them in with the treaty cards anyway. So I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. I think had the Allies gotten slightly better die roll results, the game maybe could have avoided this eventuality. But when I think about all the diplomatic mission cards that Germany had, Pact of Steel, Treaty, we went hard into diplomacy. It paid off, but it could just have easily not paid off, like it did for the Allies. And I think there's something to be said there. The Axis could get away with some decent luck, and they were able to capitalize on it. And their Fortune of War cards were all very good. Um, Fortune of War, at least for Germany, the big one was that Stormy Seas card, or Sea of Storms, whatever it was, basically helping to get the Sea Lion off. And we didn't have to commit that many resources to Sea Lion because of it. That was a big factor. So you can kind of go like, not only did Germany start with a leg up in this campaign, but their luck also tended to pay off better. Um, and those two things combined kind of really overrun the game quite a bit. I do think this would be hard to replicate when you think about how many dice rolls are involved, and all that luck maybe being a bit different. I mean, I am playing with the luck markers, and generally I think the Axis got a better deal out of having the luck marker than the Allies, because sometimes the Allied die, secondary die roll would be worse. um, it's not a surprising result, but I think you'd be hard pressed to replicate this because I just all the right things had to go right for the European Axis to get to this state. But still a really interesting playthrough. And I'll talk about Daisenso here in a minute, but it was a fun narrative, right? I think, this is looking like a strange European Union situation where most of Europe is governed by democratic nations. The Soviet Union is being brought low. Not sure what you do with that from a democratic standpoint if you're at war with the Soviet Union and performing that well. Maybe you try to instantiate some democracy in Russia. Try that. I think with Britain under wraps there's probably some need for reform and bring them back into a more democratic leaning government. So yeah, some birth of a European Union here in some weird form in a very bizarro world way. Um, you'll also notice that my map overlays have gotten shifted all over the place underneath the plexiglass. I would say if you're going to end up playing Dice of Decision with a lot of map overlays, to maybe not use plexi, because you may be able to more easily fix these little issues that I got just from bumping my own table, bumping the plexiglass. That's my bad more than anything, but I could manage it because it's like, oh, okay, I know what hex I'm in. I don't, I'm off by half an inch, but I know where I'm at hex wise, and it wasn't a big deal, especially because it was mostly all internal lines for the Axis, so I could kind of just sail stuff through there. Yeah. So yeah, then not a surprising result for Krieg. Interesting nonetheless. Kind of a get the Central Powers back together again and implement democracy. The Iron Crusade against communism. I mean, it's all very very fun narratively speaking, and still fun to play. I mean, don't get very just it's fun to play through. I've got my sort of knowledge of the mechanics of the game down well enough that I could just sort of play the game and not have to look up the rules all the time. I still did it, but not as much. So that was all good. It was really sad to see a bunch of stuff starting to pile up in Canada and not knowing exactly how I was going to make a play to get back onto the continent at that point. The U.S. Victory program might have been an interesting thing to actually get going, because you can see here, like, it puts a bunch of stuff in the force pool for the U.S. This is sort of the critical card. Like, you get a bunch of stuff, in the delay box, and you start to get some steps, and then eventually the U.S. Victory Program marker gives you continuous steps. But this is still on the delay die rolls, right? To get a lot of this stuff, um, you're really not going to see. We would not have seen America and Britain really well prepared to get back onto the continent for several turns, by which point we'd be probably getting close to the summer, or already in the summer of 42, and the Axis would have continued to run rampant against the Soviets, probably to the point where the Soviets aren't going to be able to make it back up, and then we'd get more German reinforcements probably starting to set up on the west to catch the Allies. So, it would have been fun to maybe try, but I'm not sure how fun it really would have been, because you got to pick your beachhead. Where do you go? I think the Allies tried for Lisbon to forestall any automatic victory if they could do it. Alternatively, you try to get back into Britain, but um, that might be tough going, because you got to remember you can't use air. Nothing's in range of air here, so you have to do all your beachhead work with your navies, and I guess depending on how the support markers go, right, whether or not you can keep the beachhead open and going and supplied, against the Italian Navy, the German Navy. I think eventually the Axis navies would kind of attrit away, but for a long time, that would be the struggle. I think a whole battle of the Atlantic would be needing to be played out before the Allies could expect to get back onto the continent. And by the time they're doing that and doing it in earnest, I mean, victory in Europe in 1945, I think the Axis would still be in a really strong position. I don't think a hostile faction invading Europe, having to garrison all the territory it conquers behind it, would achieve an Axis or an Allied crusade of 3 or 4 VP or automatic victory. So just wasn't going to happen. Let's start taking a look at Daisenso for a second. For Daisenso, I think similar things can be said in terms of the Axis being benefited by the results. Obviously, not as well as it worked out for Germany in Europe, but while Japan remains a totalitarian state, which means we don't get all these cool, bonuses to uh, moving through territory and in liberation, the kind of the big piece was the Soviet Union's, I guess, fragmentation. So while the Soviets almost got Siberia back in before they started running out of good plays to make, the fact that the Far East Republic had broken off in the Russian Civil War in our narrative was important, and for 2 strategic hexes. That's right, 2 whole strategic hexes, which to Japan is huge because it's hard for them to get at certain strategic hexes. Um, they were able to pick that up with treaties, and so you figure two strategic hexes. If they didn't pick those up, at most Japan would maybe be at Axis tied 2. That was pretty big. Now the other thing is, with the United States being communist, it meant that the Philippines were going to end up being independent, which it's a pro and a con. There's a pro and con to it. Without the Philippine integration card, we can't easily get steps down here, which makes the Philippines, just controlled by the United States without making it independent, actually easier for Japan to pick up, because there's just no other steps to grab. There's no other steps to even expect to get put out there. You're kind of losing out on some of these steps available to the United States. But by being independent, it's like, okay, well, there's a gray hex, there's a green hex, and neither of them are in the immediate reach of any of the factions unless Japan wants to invest the resources. But if they do, the Philippines will have defenders that will be hard to just walk into. We actually have to have a fight for the Philippines. So it was kind of a mixed bag, a double edged sword for the Philippines. But Indochina was also independent, and we were able to influence them, which I guess is not that different than the historical situation, um, just given that Japan gets control of Indochina in the historical narrative. We gave up control of Siam, though, and that was sort of the switch, right? We spent our treaty time and various things on the Far East Republic rather than Siam, but it's pretty easy, assuming you're buddies with Indochina, to smash your way into Siam, and that's what we did. Um, so we did grab with our SNLF markers um, the the islands, and that wasn't so big a deal. And it could be, I have to double check a couple of things as it relates to Daisenso, but it's I think I do want to double check some stuff. I'm not going to worry about it too much, but we were in pretty good shape to attack into Burma. I think we would have had trouble. In fact, I think we were already kind of at the extent of what Japan could expect, because it's going to be hard fighting over here. This is kind of getting well garrisoned due to a number of military aid results and things that Britain was getting that they could get steps onto the board to defend. And while America was kind of getting its slow momentum going, had they done it, they'd be pretty quickly sweeping through the Pacific. I really don't know. This would come down to the naval fights, but I would just say, we didn't focus on Navy expansion. So who knows? I mean, we might have been able to hold back the Americans long enough to still maintain a good victory threshold with Axis Tide. But again, like, not having to worry about Russia very much and getting that neutrality marker down where we don't need to worry about Siberia even. Like, we got what we needed out of the Far East Republic. That alone is just so huge. That, and there's also a gray hex that we put firmly in our control. So it was a very, like, we got a bonus, another one of those bonuses, and we could make progress. Now, I will say, I know that this Showa restoration, the political program option, probably doesn't get picked a lot, right? I feel like I did army expansion and political expansion. Those are like my army program, political program. That was my focus, to do well against China. I think that worked out, and I won't say it was like special luck or anything really happened. I just think I did well there, and I did it really methodically, tackling the Chinese puzzle. What the Showa restoration marker was doing for me was that a lot of our cards that Japan was playing were giving us colonial steps that I could put into Japanese dependence or conquered territory. And the Showa restoration marker allowed me to combine a colonial unit and a Japanese unit during reorganization, which you ordinarily can't do. The Showa restoration marker allows you to do it. It just puts the marker on the delay box. But we had pretty good delay roll modifiers, so I could keep doing that. And if I got lucky enough with the die roll, and a few times I did, I could kind of do that back to back. So I could attack, I could lose a step, I could get more steps onto the board relatively quickly, regular steps in Japan that get transported over to China, or those colonial steps coming in. I didn't have to rely on this logistics marker that we didn't get until Total War to maintain a drive and attrit each Chinese faction individually. And I think what you have to watch out for as Japan in Daisenso is, if you're fighting, you want to try to concentrate on one Chinese minor country at a time if you can help it. Because the Chinese do get a lot of steps eventually. Like, the cards will give them steps, the conditional events will give them steps. on a pretty frequent basis. In some cases, every turn it's possible to get steps. So you're very often going to be fighting Sichuan or Yunnan or even Jiangsu with a lot of their force pool deployed. But here's the thing: if you shut down an entire province and you conquer it, right? They don't have access to those steps anymore, and so they might get more and more steps, but they will have an issue because they're maxed out. They're maxed out on how many more they can deploy. You're gonna have wasted steps, and while you can try to get these forces moved forward, it worked out for Japan in this campaign where I could kind of like I went from Hope to Kansu and was able to kind of make progress either way. And the Chinese didn't really have good stacking bits to kind of put me in a tough situation. So, and I probably still could have played better, I guess, as the Chinese, as the Western allies, to maybe slow down the Japanese. But we had okay die rolls, and okay is good enough if you can get more Japanese steps in place, which I was doing pretty consistently. We had the HQs, and what we could just do was, again, focus effort, shut down a front, move on to the next one, focus effort, shut down that province, cut off the places that those reinforcements can come in. And by the time more reinforcements were coming, it was kind of too late. Or, they had to make a choice to defend in a mountain rather than the flat. And even then, with enough strength, you can break a line somewhere and then attack a hex without the terrain penalties. So I will pat myself on the back and say, as Japan, I think I did the Chinese campaign pretty well. It worked out. My focus on army and Showa restoration capabilities synergized pretty well, and we were fortunate enough to get all the things that we needed to get done. It did cost a fair amount of steps, so I think that could have maybe hurt in the long run, but we were also running low on our force pool anyway. So really hard to say, kind of like, did I make all the right choices? Well, you figure we're doing very well. Axis Tide 3 is Japan. That's really hard to get. We might have gotten to Axis Tide 4 if we did well here, and that's about as much as I could expect to ever get. And we'd be playing the Japanese equivalent of Fortress Europa, I forget what it's called, and saying, okay, beat that, allies. And here's the thing, I do think the sort of Asian continent strategy is strong, because that the Americans are going to beat the crap out of you. There's no way to avoid that in the present campaign, a totalitarian Japan against anything else United States. But Britain, you can kind of focus effort over here. And if you do well enough over here, Britain is not going to be getting a huge amount of steps coming onto the board over here. They'll get plenty, to be sure, but you can concentrate your strength better here and pick up those extra strategic hexes that you need for victory. And for the Allies to take them back, right? If the whole point is you need to get Allied crusade beyond the Axis threshold, they've either got to take so many more gray hexes that they can make up the deficit, and they need to reclaim at least some of their stuff back. But where are they going to get it from? Is Russia going to get it? Is Russia going to get at anything? I mean, they'd be lucky to get back into the Far East Republic territories in a single season. They might get a couple of these. Britain's going to have a hard time, maybe with concentrated effort, you push the Japanese out of a few of them. Then the Americans are certainly going to pick up some hexes here, right? They're going to get Rabaul back probably, maybe Truk back, Saipan, Iwo Jima. They'll certainly pick up a fair number, but the question would be, would it be enough? And could they get some partisans going in China? I think that's reasonable to expect. That could have eventually really developed better. But because China's not exactly as well garrisoned as it could be in some places, so I do think partisans could have been a drag. So I don't know. It is feasible that the Allies could have won the Daisenso map here, but I think Japan was doing so very well that it wasn't a major concern. Um, so again, this is one of those like the Daisa decision really benefited the Axis because these extra minor countries are kind of up there for grabs, like the Far East Republic. Probably the most important pickup of this whole thing was that and that alone. Um, because otherwise, the oil embargo came up. We got rid of that. Japan's sitting pretty with a -3 delay diral modifier. That gives them just so much more latitude in using their air capabilities, using their naval capabilities against the Western allies to allow them to just pick up more and more stuff. It was going to be a tough crawl back into a good position for the allies. They were really going to have to wait for the U.S. commitment level to increase, and that's going to take years to really pick up. So again, I think if Dice of Decision gives benefits to the Axis, particularly early on, and they're able to make up a lot of ground early, right? If their high tide is higher than historical, that certainly makes it harder for the Allies to come back, especially with all the negatives or challenges that we had in our game. So really not a surprising result, but still a very fun one nonetheless. To wrap up this post-mortem video, which I know has just been me yammering on about how things went, just to touch upon Schiffskrieg for a moment, I do think my opinion has softened a little bit on the Schiffskrieg thing. I think there's an accusation made that I've been very critical of Schiffskrieg in terms of the value it brings, vice the effort you have to add in. Um, I'm kind of it's annoying to hear somebody say, well, there are more complex games, and so that should give a free pass to Schiffskrieg or something. When it's like, well, what's the exchange, right? Um, if you're going to add a bunch of additional steps that the players are going to execute, the payoff for that should be worth something. If it's something you're adding to the game, right? If you're going to change the game, are you getting something for whatever it is? If it's additional fidelity, if it's additional capabilities for the game, new mechanics or whatever, it should be something that feels worthwhile. And so you can look at a complex game, one where complexity maybe isn't even an option. It's just the game is baseline more complex than other games. You can make an argument that the fidelity you get out of it in the game mechanics itself are the reward for it. It's just you want that level of fidelity, and not everybody wants that. With Schiffskrieg, because it doesn't change the underlying mechanics, it's like, okay, what I want to see is the usage of Schiffskrieg leading to a different result than if I were not playing with it. If I get the same basic result, it's sort of, if you've heard the term the closed watch case, what's going on underneath the hood of a situation. In the base game, the support markers duke it out. You have delay die roll modifiers that kind of tells you who won retroactively. I do think that's kind of lame, just in terms of like the exciting events, right? It's like, oh well, we'll figure that out later in the delay segment. Um, and all the real fighting is happening underneath the hood, right outside the player's eyes. Playing with Schiffskrieg lifts the hood. You zoom into that, but the output is all the same, and so or tends to be the same. And so this is the point I want to hit. I think that's the concern, right? Does the stuff happening underneath the hood lead to a different outcome, and does it matter? It has to matter. Now, I'm happy to say that, at least in this campaign, it did matter. And it mattered in the capability of the choice of how much air to contribute to any given air support unit and naval support unit, where we had cases where the Russian planes were so beat up they had a hard time being able to operate. And what it meant was that we could put fewer actual land-based air units into German support markers and had a lot more flexibility with where we could reach and what we could do with them because of that, at least for a period of time. So that was a difference maker at the air level. And for Britain, Britain had sent a lot of their air to escort their naval flotillas as an as an option. You can send land-based air in, but they did it so much that they actually ran out of LBAs to use effectively for their air units, which contributed to some of our sea lion activities. The presence of the German carriers had a pretty, I think, significant shift in terms of the staying power of the German Navy, that the German Navy could expect to go out and do more sorties because there was less concern that we were going to lose all of our cruisers and battleships to air superiority. We could contest the air, we could force a day action on our terms and not just get stuck with a day action where the Commonwealth aircraft carriers just shoot the crap out of our stuff. I did have German submarines snipe an aircraft carrier of the British early on, and that mattered. And I'm gonna so I don't know, it's so much of a position change as validating what I thought could be true when I played my 1944 campaign in Dicenso, which is the earlier in the war or the game or the campaign that you're playing with Schiffskrieg, the better, because those consequences have more life to ripple out, right? The consequences of the actions, the results, the combats have more time to breathe, and they have more longer term effects where a later scenario where the allies are already enjoying many benefits, it may not add as much. So that's the same position I had before. I think I still have that position, but it is ringing more true that there is value to having Schiff's Creek present. One, because you get that immediate feeling that somebody's won, or it's not just the die roll modifiers, but you have a sense of material loss, which that might be just dopamine benefits more than it is mechanical benefits, but I will take a dopamine benefit at least to one part. And then again, referencing the sinking of the aircraft carrier with a sub patrol, the presence of German aircraft carriers, the attrition of air power for moments of time where some markers don't really become functional any longer. Seeing those things helps to back up the idea that, yeah, Schiff's Creek can have an effect beyond than if you were not playing with it. It may not be huge, but it is there, and that's probably enough to justify playing with it for a lot of people. Um, so there's that. Now, I do think you save a lot of time by not playing with it, and I think I probably would have had just as good of a time playing this campaign without it than with it. Well, maybe slightly less. I'll give it that much. I think the German aircraft carriers were an interesting twist, but I don't know that it added a huge amount to it. But if somebody said, "Hey, I'm only going to play Axis Empires with Schiffskrieg," and assuming they're not asking somebody to play a 1944 campaign, I'd agree with that. I'd say, yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, makes sense. Let's play with Schiffskrieg. Let's do that 1937 on. We'll see what happens. I think that's a perfectly valid way to play, and it's in the box. And I don't think the rules are that much more to know. I just think again, it adds more things you have to do at the table. It's going to extend the gameplay time a decent little bit there, depending on how much air stuff and naval stuff you're actually doing. But there's worth there, and so I get that's where I'm settling out on that. We'll talk about that in the review, but that's kind of the preview of my thoughts on it. So yeah, there you go, guys. That's a swing at a full combined game campaign. It ends early due to the strangeness of our dice of decision, but overall a good time. And yeah, so hope this was informative or at least of interest if you listen to this whole bit here and just absorbing the gameplay. As I'm going to seek to eventually clean this game up, I've got to rethink how I'm organizing my counters and my baggies and how I want to have this organized for the long haul. I do expect to play Axis Empires again in the future. Maybe not on the channel for a while. There's other games I want to get to playing, but I've had a good time with my 40-some videos of Axis Empires content and what has occupied me now for the last couple of gaming months. So next video will be the review, so we'll see you at that one if you watch that. And yeah, until next time, guys, take care, keep gaming, see you later.